Welcome. This program is called the Enemy Alien Files, the Department of Justice Internment Experience of World War II. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Rosalind Tonai. I'm here as Executive Director of the National Japanese American Historical Society. Pleased to present this Enemy Alien Files Consortium exhibition that's going throughout the country. Our speakers today are Grace Shimizu. Grace Shimizu is a longtime activist. She's the project director of the Japanese Peruvian Oral History Project and the project manager for the Enemy Aliens Consortium. She serves as the director for the Campaign for Justice, Redress Now for Japanese Latin Americans. Our next speaker is Dr. Stacey Camp. She's a doctor of archaeology and professor at Michigan State University in Lansing, where she is the director of the MSU Campus Archaeological Program. Before that, she taught at the University of Idaho, where she oversaw the archaeology of Kuskia internment camp, which housed enemy aliens, primarily Issei, during World War II. She is with us to share her knowledge about the site and what we've learned about the internment of Japanese enemy aliens during this time period. And our final speaker is Lilith Benjamin. She is the National Japanese American Historical Society Collection Manager. She holds a Master's of Museum Studies from the University of Toronto. She is going to discuss some of the artifacts we have related to the incarceration, actually in the internment of Japanese enemy aliens at Santa Fe. Thank you. So without further ado, Enemy Alien Files has toured to the University of Maryland, Boise State University for the American Association for State and Local History, and to Crystal City Pilgrimage and the local community college. We want to particularly thank the internees who courageously shared their poignant stories for the exhibition and research. Thanks to our funders, the Japanese American confinement sites administered by the National Park Service, which is a special grant, and the generous matching support from our donors, including the Chizu and Ernest Iyama Memorial Fund and members of the National Japanese American Historical Society. You could see the exhibit actually online through this QR code and also through its traveling venue. Thank you very much for participating and joining us today.
Hello, I'm Rosalind Tonai, Executive Director of the National Japanese American Historical Society. I'm speaking to you from the Presidio of San Francisco, where the infamous Executive Order 9066 was implemented. It called for the mass exclusion, removal, and incarceration of 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry at the start of World War II. This exhibition, Enemy Alien Files, has been updated from its original first run in 2001. It explores the combined experience of what happened to some 31,000 German, Italian, and Japanese enemy aliens living in the U.S. and Latin America during World War II.
People are so unbelievably shocked to find out that this happened to the Germans and the Italians.
600,000 Italian Americans nationwide, legal residents of the United States, were designated enemy aliens by Presidential Proclamation 2527 on December 8, 1942.
My father was taken on the night of December 7th and registered on the early mornings of the 8th at Terminal Island Correctional Facility.
For mostly unsubstantiated reasons, with no charges of wrongdoing filed, these residents were marked as enemy aliens and subjected to arrest and imprisonment for the duration of the war.
You know, we were born in Peru, and that was our home, and the United States yanked us out of there.
Punishing people, that is, exiling them, putting them behind barbed wire, forcing them out of their homes and businesses for what they might do, is essentially punishing people for who they are.
We are seeking that the U.S. government fully acknowledge and disclose what happened.
I believe that accountability is very, very, very important. Groups, individuals, governments, states, entities that commit crimes against humanity must be held accountable.
And when you suspend, the rules that are in place to protect us all, when you suspend those rules for certain people, they can be suspended for everybody.
So thank you, Stacey. Now here to discuss Enemy Alien Files exhibition and the scholarship around the Japanese Latin American experience of World War II, Grace Shimizu.
In the late 1930s, as turmoil in Europe and Asia escalated, the U.S. government began to prepare for the possibility of U.S. involvement in war. Preparations included surveillance of Japanese, German, and Italian resident aliens, compiling lists of potentially dangerous persons, and plans for internment and deportation. This was massive racial and ethnic profiling of the German, Italian, and Japanese American communities, not based on action or evidence, but based on vague profiling of who could potentially be dangerous. Before and during the war, there were investigation methods and criminal laws on the books to deal with saboteurs and spies. But the U.S. government went beyond that to cast a wide net over Japanese, German, and Italian American communities and profiled them as the enemy and targeted their immigrant community leaders, educators, journalists, religious leaders, and business owners as potentially dangerous enemy aliens. Then suspicion and harassment and persecution quickly expanded to include U.S. citizens of those ancestries, many being children and young adults, and they were treated as the perpetual foreigner, and this resulted in a chilling effect, violations of civil liberties and human rights, and trauma inflicted upon their communities nationwide, and even extending beyond U.S. borders into Latin America. On December 7th, 1941, President Roosevelt authorized the FBI to arrest without warrant any Japanese citizen 14 years or older. The next day, this was applied against German and Italian aliens as well. This action was authorized under the Alien Enemy Act of 1918, which specifies that citizens age 14 or over of enemy nations can be, quote, apprehended, restricted, secured, and removed, unquote, in case of declared war or actual or threatened invasion by a foreign nation. No distinction is made between resident immigrants and aliens in the U.S. on a temporary basis. So overnight, almost 1 million law-abiding immigrants were transformed into enemy aliens. And under the Enemy Alien Program, around 25,000 of these enemy aliens were imprisoned from the U.S. mainland and Hawaii. And on this basis, we also saw the U.S. President issue Executive Order 9066, which authorized the systematic mandatory mass exclusion and removal of U.S. citizens and aliens of Japanese ancestry from West Coast military areas and led to their incarceration in wartime relocation authority camps. But what is not widely known, Executive Order 9066 also permitted the expulsion of all German and Italian enemy aliens and selected naturalized citizens from designated military areas across the country. The Alien Enemy Act of 1918 has not been repealed and is still on the books for use. The targeting of the enemy went beyond the 110,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, both citizen and immigrant residents in the U.S. Over 31,000 enemy aliens of German, Italian, and Japanese ancestry in the United States and from Latin America were excluded, apprehended, forcibly relocated, detained, and thousands interned for reasons of national security, but without charges, incarcerated for indefinite duration, held without trial. And for those in the United States who were detained and given a hearing, they were not told of any charges against them and not allowed to confront witnesses and were not allowed the counsel of attorneys. Most internees were released from camp by the end of the war in 1946, but some were still interned until 1949 in Ellis Island. Some internees had been interned for 7 years. The dragnet swept over 150,000 people of Japanese, German, Italian, and Jewish ancestry over 2 continents, and the chilling effect it had on all of our communities in the face of such government abuse of our rights. Almost 2 million non-citizen immigrant and millions more who were citizens across 2 continents. And the loss of freedom goes beyond the 10 War Relocation Authority concentration camps. There were also over 50 other camps and detention facilities run by the Department of Justice and the U.S. Army. They were camps under 3 distinct administrations, but coordinated in an overall system of enemy control and imprisonment. The exclusion and forced relocation also included World War II-style extraordinary rendition. From December 7, 1941 through December 1945, over 6,000 men, women, and children of German, Italian, and Japanese ancestry from 18 Latin American countries, both immigrant residents as well as citizens of those countries, were taken from their homes and businesses, forcibly deported, and interned in U.S. concentration camps. Those of German ancestry numbered 4,058, and included 81 Jewish refugees who had fled the European war zones seeking safe haven in Latin America. There were also 288 of Italian ancestry and 2,264 of Japanese ancestry. My father was one of nearly 1,800 persons of Japanese ancestry taken from Peru. And beyond incarceration, there was the hostage exchange. Over 4,800 men, women, and children were forcibly deported to war zones of the Far East and Europe in prisoner exchanges. These included U.S. citizens who were the minor children of permanent resident aliens. For persons of German ancestry in the U.S. and from Latin America, there were about 6 exchanges of at least 2,000 people. Of them, it is unclear how many were German Latin Americans. For persons of Japanese ancestry, there were 2 exchanges, with over 2,800 civilians exchanged, including over 1,200 Japanese Latin Americans. Then there were the post-war deportations to Japan and Germany, the struggle to survive under conditions of U.S. or other allied military occupation, war devastation, and deprivation. Lives disrupted, loss of property, loss of educational opportunity, emotional, physical violence. Can you hear that background? Oh, okay. Later review of records of these dangerous enemy aliens show there was often no specific evidence of subversive activities. Rather, they lost years of their lives on the basis of potential danger. It was massive racial, ethnic profiling. It was racism, xenophobia, political opportunism, and economic profiteering. And its impact has been felt through the generations to today. The impact of these violations has been long-standing in our communities, and now we realize the present-day significance for this country and our democratic institutions and freedoms. The exhibit hopes to expand the World War II narrative of those targeted as the enemy during World War II. It makes more full and inclusive the historical narrative. the understanding of the historical reality of what happened to communities targeted and scapegoated as the enemy during World War II. By expanding the narrative to include the experience of Japanese, German, Italian, and Jewish nationals from the US and from Latin America who were targeted as potentially dangerous enemy aliens, we can deepen our understanding of the xenophobic and nativist attack and its racist particularity against the Japanese nationals. By preserving the experience of Japanese immigrant residents and Japanese American citizens in the US, we see the particularized racist and xenophobic attack resulting in their racialized mass incarceration and stripping of citizenship and immigrant rights. Through the decades after the end of World War II and into this century, the challenge to achieve the genuine security of our nation while upholding the constitutional and human rights of all persons in the U.S. continues, whether in times of war, social crisis, or peace. The danger of history repeating itself for immigrant residents and other non-citizens, as well as citizens, is far-reaching for democracy, liberty, and human dignity.
My name is Stacey Camp, and I am Associate Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Campus Archeology program at Michigan State University. And today I'm going to be talking about the Kuski internment camp and the archaeological work that I have done at this site and a little bit of the history of this site to give you context as to why I have been interested in this research. Just so you know, I wanted to give a bit of background as to how I got involved in this project initially. Many, many years ago, I was a faculty member at the University of Idaho, where I met Dr. Priscilla Wagers, who is a historical archaeologist like myself, and also the director of the Asian American Comparative Collection at the University of Idaho. And she mentioned that she was working on a book about the history of the Kuski internment camp. And she had told me that she had been in contact with a number of people who had been incarcerated there, as well as the descendant community. And she thought it would make a really interesting research project archaeologically because no one had explored the archaeology of the state. And I am a historical archaeologist who's worked in predominantly the Western United States, focusing on immigrants' lives during the late 19th and early 20th century. So it fit within my research interests. And I also, as a public archaeologist, I was very excited at the prospect of working with living communities who had either been incarcerated at the site or had family members who had been incarcerated at the site. So this seemed like a great opportunity to not only educate my students at the University of Idaho about this history, but also to work with a variety of communities that had a tie to the Kuski internment camp. So I wanted to acknowledge that Dr. Wagers got me involved in this project. She did finish not only one book on the Kuski internment camp, but actually two books about the history of the site, because it was not only a World War II internment camp, it was also a federal prison before it was an internment camp. It was a CCC camp, and it was also a mine. So it has a very long history of being utilized for a variety of things. So where is the Kuski internment camp located? The Kuski internment camp, like many incarceration sites from this time period, is located in a very isolated part of the Western United States. It is located in Idaho, and the closest university is about 3 hours away. The university that I worked at, the University of Idaho, is about 3 hours away. To this day, there's no cell phone service out there. The internet is very limited, so it remains a very remote place. And I think the closest town, which is Lowell, Idaho, has maybe 23 residents, some of whom had family members work as prison officials at the Kuski internment camp, and we were able to meet those folks as well. This is a close-up of the landscape. So as I mentioned, the Kuski internment camp was an internment camp, and it was really designed to incarcerate people who were considered enemy aliens. And this term is really problematic because it implies that the people had done something wrong, and that was not the case with the over 260 folks who were incarcerated here. The crime that they had committed was not a crime. but they ended up incarcerated because they were predominantly Japanese Americans. And during World War II, as I'm sure you know, the majority of folks who were incarcerated were Japanese American due to their history and connection with the war, but none of them committed any crimes. The majority of people who were incarcerated, 2/3 of the 120,000 folks who were incarcerated that were Japanese American, were American citizens and had not done anything wrong. The folks at Kuski were not American citizens. They were known as what we call Issei. They were first generation Japanese men who were targeted by the United States government because they were prominent members of their communities. They were businessmen, they were priests, they were community leaders, they were people that could get things done, and they therefore posed a threat in terms of organizing, at least from the United States government's perspective during World War II. So these men were specifically singled out because they did not have citizenship, and they were successful folks who could organize groups of people. They did not have citizenship because you could not obtain legal citizenship as a Japanese American during this time period. And that was due to the racially exclusionary laws of the time. So even if they wanted citizenship, and I'm sure many of them, would consider themselves American citizens because they'd been here so long, they could not obtain citizenship. So they were unfairly targeted. One of the things that also makes this site unique is that because they were not American citizens, they were considered prisoners of war. Now, none of these men came from Japan directly, were not brought during the war from Japan to Kuski. They mostly came from Southern California, Terminal Island, Washington, Oregon, coastal cities. But because they did not have citizenship, they were considered prisoners of war legally. So because of that, they were guaranteed all of the allotments outlined by the Geneva Convention. And the Geneva Convention stipulates how prisoners of war and internees are to be treated. So I would argue, based off everything I've read about this site, the archives, and the archaeology that I've conducted, I would argue that their condition of living was much different and perhaps a bit better than folks who were incarcerated in what we call WRA sites, or War Relocation Authority sites, which housed the majority of the Japanese American citizens who were incarcerated. So one of the sites that we've been working on to digitize their archaeological collections is Minidoka, which is about, say, 4 or 5 hours south of Kuski. And the people that were incarcerated there were Japanese American citizens. So their treatment was very different because the Geneva Convention did not apply to a country incarcerating its own citizens. So this is an overview of the landscape. It's a Google aerial, and you can see there's a little dot that says Kuski internment camp, and that is where we've been working archaeologically for several field seasons back in 2010 and 2013. And that is also the location of where the Japanese American men were incarcerated and kept in barracks. If you go a little bit north on this map, you'll see another dot, and it says Apgar Campground. That is a location of where the prison officials lived. So the prison officials lived half a mile away from the Japanese American incarcerees on an entirely different landscape and better housing conditions. And here is a historic photograph of the barracks in which the Japanese American incarcerees lived. And if you look to the modern photograph, it's not that modern anymore. I guess suppose it's somewhat modern, but this photograph that we have that's color is from 2010. And that was from one of the field seasons that we conducted at the site of the Kuski internment camp at the barracks location. So that rectangle on the historic photograph represents the area in which we were working during the 2010 field season. You'll also see a man with a dog in the corner of the color photograph from 2010. And that is a man, a colleague of mine, Dr. Hines, who conducted ground penetrating radar on the landscape to identify if there was any sort of material remains of the barracks landscape. I'm not going to go into too much detail today about all of the archaeology that we've conducted, but one of the things that I wanted to point out that was a bit disappointing is that when we first came to the site, we noticed as we were driving into the site that the landscape seemed to have an elevation. We seemed to be going up on the road, whereas if you look at the historic photograph here in the slides, this landscape looks pretty level to us. And we kept noting that and saying, what, did something happen here? After conducting ground penetrating radar, which essentially gives us an x-ray of what's beneath the ground. I'm simplifying the science, but that's how I usually explain it to my students. We discovered that this site had been heavily disturbed and that our observation that something had happened to the landscape was correct. We also conducted something called shovel testing on the landscape, which is essentially putting a variety of small holes on the landscape about 50 by 50 centimeters in width and about 1 meter down into the ground. And that gives us a perspective of what's going on in the landscape without excavating the entire landscape or opening up bigger excavation units that can take a lot of time. And those shovel tests revealed lots and lots of very large rocks, as well as pieces of the highway. So this site is right next to US Highway 12. And the incarcerees there were working on building that highway. So when we found what looked like modern highway on the landscape, we realized something had happened. And it just so happened that one of the days that we were having lunch on the site and working on the site, some employees from the Michigan Department of Transportation stopped by and asked what we were doing. We have a permit. This is in Clearwater National Forest, so we had to get a permit to do this work. And we asked them if they knew anything about this site, and they didn't realize that this was, Idaho Department of Transportation. We did not realize that, or they did not realize that this was the site of the Kuski internment camp. And they had stated that they thought that there had been highway-related debris dumped on this landscape for quite a long time. And we believed that a lot of the archaeology we were seeing and the data from the ground penetrating radar demonstrated that indeed the barracks landscape had been dumped upon for many years because there's no signage at this site. So that was kind of unfortunate. However, we did move on to work in a trash dump that was across the creek from the barracks. And when it was the Kuski internment camp, there were bridges there that people could cross as well as vehicles could cross, and they could dump trash across from the barracks. They also had something called an incinerator where they could burn organic trash. And so that is actually still on the landscape to this day. So we focused our attention on the trash dump associated with the internment camp, and we excavated that and found a lot of different artifacts that I think reflect a great deal about the condition of the camp and the Geneva Convention and how it impacted the incarcerees here at the Kuski internment camp. So I'm going to show you some of the artifacts that we recovered from this particular area of the site. I also wanted to point out that we returned to the site in 2013 and continued excavations in the trash dump because there were so many artifacts there pertaining to the Kuski internment camp. So one of the things that we found were lots of gaming pieces. And the Kuski internment camp incarcerees had actually petitioned the United States government to provide the provisions that were outlined in the Geneva Convention. So when they arrived there in May of 1943, they discovered that they didn't have a doctor, they didn't have a dentist, they didn't have any sort of things to pass the time. They were very, very isolated there, just like I said today. It's a very isolated landscape as well. So they crafted a letter and let the government know that the things that they were promised in the Geneva Convention that the government had to legally uphold were not actually there at the site. So some of the gaming pieces that we find we think might be a reflection of the incarcerees trying to pass the time as they waited for the government to comply with the Geneva Convention. A lot of the gaming pieces are carved and crafted from the stones and materials on the landscape, including we have some mortar gaming pieces. You could buy these gaming pieces for a game called Go. They were sold commercially all over the West Coast, but it looks like most of the gaming pieces they made. Some of them were commercially manufactured, but a number of them were manufactured there by the incarcerees on site. So some of them are made out of stone, some of them are made out of construction materials like mortar. This gaming piece that you see at the top here, we're not exactly sure what it was used for. Unfortunately, all the gaming pieces that look like this are burnt. They're probably in someone's pants and it was put into the incinerator. At least that's our best guess. They look like mahjong pieces, but it's hard to tell because there's no writing that we can read legibly. So we think it maybe is a mahjong piece, but we're not sure. They were manufactured out of bone. They could have been manufactured on site from animal bone, but they could have also been purchased that way. And here you see a historic photograph of men playing Go. We also found artwork. And one of the questions that I get regularly asked as an archaeologist is, what is the most interesting archaeological discovery you've made? And I think this is probably the most exciting find that I've made on a site, or one of my students has made, I should say. And you can see here, there's two pieces of artwork. The first piece of artwork is some sort of anthropomorphic figure, animal, human looking. We haven't decided what it is. We have lots of different theories. Some people think it's a dog. Some people feel it's a cat. Some people feel that it's an otter. We've had a lot of different theories, but the person who crafted this would have had to spend a lot of time making it. They may have disposed of it because they broke the stone. So the stone itself is sandstone, which is very delicate, and it is local to the area. We had a geologist come out and take a look at it and let us know that it was indeed from the area. So we think this is a reflection of someone trying to pass the time because they didn't know how long they were going to be incarcerated. The other pieces of artwork were found also in the trash dump, and they have a variety of different kinds of rocks that were found on the landscape, or were found by the incarcerees on the landscape. And a number of the rocks look like they could potentially be projectile points that were used by the Nez Perce, who historically, proto-historically, prehistorically have occupied this landscape. And what would have gone in the middle of this? Well, we think it may be a bonsai plant, it could be a pencil holder, it could be a vase. This kind of artwork has been seen at Minidoka, as well as at Fort Missoula, which was another Department of Justice incarceration site like Kuski. We've done a lot of community outreach at this site. When I leave the site, it's kind of a rare occurrence for me to be able to come back to it unless I'm living there permanently, which is very unusual for an archaeologist. As campus archaeology director at Michigan State, I'm here all the time, but that's very unusual. So one of the things that we wanted to do before we left is to make sure that we had people who would watch over the site and consider themselves site stewards, protectors of the landscape. So we did a number of public archaeology outreach events with the community, had them get involved in cleaning the artifacts, curating the artifacts, digging on the site, screening artifacts. And we also held an overnight experience for middle school students in the area that was funded by Three Rivers Resort. That family is still very, very active in the public schools in Kuski and have 4 children that have gone through them, and they continue to go out the site and protect it. I just saw them last month, and they continue to go out and monitor the site conditions. Here's just a photograph of some of the public archaeology events that we did. This one was at Three Rivers Resort, which is now owned by other folks, and you can see photographs of Priscilla's 2 books on the Kuski internment camp. My students in 2013, they brought posters about the research they had conducted on some of the artifacts that they found at the Kuski internment camp. So we were able to share some of our discoveries with the local community. Finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about is the importance of making sure we share this story beyond the area, because there's not a lot of people that live in this area. And we want to make sure we can share this story with the descendant community who can't often make it to the site because it's so remote. And so my goal has been to make sure that we digitize the data and put it online, not only for the descendant community and stakeholder groups, but also for other archaeologists who are studying the archaeology of Japanese American incarceration during World War II. So I initially got a grant through the Idaho Humanities Council when I was at the University of Idaho to build a website that featured a good majority of the artifacts that we have cataloged and photographed that were recovered from Kuski. I also wanted to share our publications and student research that have been conducted. And then I moved over here to Michigan State University 7 years ago, and I'm very lucky that we have a unit here called Matrix that supports very, very large, robust digital projects. And so we went after a National Park Service Japanese American Confinement Sites grant. I've had a number of those for this research project over the years to support a more robust, essentially public-facing, less researcher-oriented, archaeologist-oriented website that shares the stories of incarcerees and their families from both Minidoka and the Kuski internment camp. This site will go live later this year. We're just finishing up the grant, but it will allow people to track family members. If they have family that were incarcerated at either one of these sites, it'll allow them to access any sort of artifacts that were recovered from both Minidoka and Kuski, or objects that have been donated at Minidoka. It will allow people to access curriculum that's specifically developed around both Kuski and Minidoka. So that's oriented towards students in middle school, since in middle school, at least in Common Core here in the United States, students start to learn about World War II incarceration. So we're really excited about this project. We'll be sharing it on all different forums.
Thank you so much, Grace and Dr. Camp. The history of internment of non-U.S. citizens, especially of long-time residents, is one I was unfamiliar with when I started working at the National Japanese American Historical Society. I thought I was well educated about this history. I had grown up in a Japanese American household. I had been to see the Lieutenant Governor of Idaho sign a resolution apologizing for the state's role in incarceration as an undergraduate. But the story of incarceration is often hidden from us. It's a tough history. To graduate school in Toronto, in Ontario, I had read the Penguin History of Canada in preparation. I thought I knew about the incarceration of Japanese Canadians, but I didn't. It was a historic house museum that taught me about these sorts of hidden stories. In 1948, two young Japanese Canadians Harold and Hannah Kawase, started a new life in Toronto in the attic of Campbell House. They would live in that attic until 1951. They lived there because Harold's boss, Claire F. Wood, owned a glass company that was headquarters out of the house, and he allowed them to live in the attic. Wood was one of the few wealthy businessmen in Canada who opposed the incarceration of Japanese Canadian, and as part of his opposition, he sought to employ as many Japanese Canadians as he could, as it was extraordinarily difficult for Japanese Canadians to get anything more than menial. The couple came to Toronto in 1948 because of the particularities of incarceration of people of Japanese ancestry in Canada. Japanese Canadians experienced a far different incarceration than Japanese Americans. They faced incarceration in remote and wild British Columbian interior, in road camps along the Trans-Canada Highway and Alaskan Highway, where Japanese Canadian young men were forced to build those highways through some of the roughest and most remote terrain in North America. Those who were not working on the roads were often confined in ghost towns or other abandoned work sites that were hastily converted into incarceration sites, or were sent into the interior to Alberta to work on sugar beet plantations in conditions later described by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation as, quote, like slavery. And tragically, in 1944, facing pressure to determine what to do with Japanese Canadians after the war, the Canadian federal government created a questionnaire. The intent was to separate loyal from disloyal Japanese Canadians. It gave them a stark choice: agree to move on short notice east of the Rockies or be deported to Japan. Some 10,000 Japanese Canadians, most of whom were simply unable to make arrangements to move east, chose, or in the case of those who showed hesitation, officials chose for them to be deported. Almost 4,000 Canadians of Japanese ancestry would be deported to Japan for 1947, when the program halted. Of those, the majority had never seen Japan. Many were dependent minors. The goal had been explicit: to remove all Japanese from the province of British Columbia. It wouldn't be until 1988 that then Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, along with the Parliament of Canada, issued a formal apology and redress to Japanese Canadians and belatedly restored citizenship to all deportees. A month after, President Reagan issued a similar apology to Japanese Americans. Hidden incarceration stretches around the world. We've heard from Grace and Stacey about a hidden American story of, quote, enemy aliens. At the National Japanese American Historical Society, we have a few objects of those internees, and I wanted to share them with you. I thought it would be best to focus on one camp, that of Santa Fe. Santa Fe internment camp was originally a civilian conservation corps camp during the New Deal, and in September of 1942 it was reopened under the Immigration and Naturalization Service of the United States as an alien internment camp. Specifically, it was meant to hold Issei men, oftentimes community leaders. These Issei were prominent community members, Buddhist ministers, lawyers, newspaper editors, people who the U.S. government feared were dangerous. The camp briefly closed after 1942 when the first group of Issei were either paroled back to their families or sent to permanent INS camps elsewhere, though by March of 1943, when the INS took over the bulk of management of civilian internees from the Army, Santa Fe was reopened again to house Japanese aliens, including some renunciants, the majority of whom were from Tule Lake and were in the process of being deported, having relinquished their U.S. citizenship, often under coercion. By the end of its life, 4,555 Japanese Americans, 4,555 internees have been incarcerated at Santa Fe. Calligraphy has been a popular art form in Japan since as early as the 1000s. Hitsu Zendo was born out of this. It is the Zen practice of writing calligraphy. The calligrapher has only one chance for each stroke and must have a mastery over one's body and intention. Any hesitation or mistake will show in the ink, and the ink is indelible. It forms a kind of physical meditation, requiring profound mindfulness to produce beautiful calligraphy. For internees and other incarcerees, it also had a major advantage. The tools for it are small and portable. You could bring a brush, ink stick, and inkstone with you. This example of traditional Japanese calligraphy features 4 central columns of Japanese text with 22 columns of Japanese characters radiating out from that center text, along with 4 English signatures belonging to Haru Sakamoto, Chi Morikai, and Beth Amano. These women formed a Buddhist women's group outside of Santa Fe, and they sent this handkerchief with its calligraphy to the Buddhist ministers interned at Santa Fe. Traditionally, calligraphy is not written on textiles, but rather on mulberry paper. But for the most part, internees and incarcerees lacked access to mulberry paper, and we can see the adoption of non-traditional materials throughout almost all the examples of objects from the internment and incarceration sites. This piece, done by Reverend T. Suzuki, was made in May of 1942. Here we can see a combination of calligraphy along with landscape art. In the foreground, we can see an elongated bell and bell stand, shrubbery, and then a Santa Fe barracks. Beyond it, we can see the exterior environs of the camp, the mountains that surrounded the camp, and the fields, where in the background we can see the mountains that dominated the environment around the camp, along with the low foothills in which the camp itself existed. This handkerchief from May of 1942 has a similar design pattern. Foreground with low foothills, and then mountains in the background. This one, though, features a bright, multicolored town at the foot of the mountains, rather than the austere Santa Fe camp, which we see in the previous handkerchief. This particular piece was made by Kei Takamura, and a stamp on the left features the words in English, barracks number, then a blank space for the number, Santa Fe Detention Center, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Pardon me. The piece, signed by Kei Takamura, also features a INS camp stamp along the left of the landscape. All three handkerchiefs were donated by the Berkeley Buddhist Temple in 1996 to the National Japanese American Historical Society. Woodworking was another popular art form and way to pass time. Wood was commonly available, ideally wood purchased or permitted to be cut for purpose by camp administrators, but failing that, scrap wood was always handy. Those incarcerated often were expected to build their own incarceration camps, and so woodworking tools were always handy as well. Wooden objects created an in-camp range from the utilitarian to the religiously important, from the mundane to the highly artistic. In this case, we see something a bit more utilitarian. A wooden label with inked calligraphy and then varnish to protect the calligraphy. The creation of butsudans was also popular among those confined in the camps. They were space-conscious ways of continuing Buddhist religious practice. This example, made by Minyo Matoba at Santa Fe, is made with traditional Japanese joinery techniques, so it doesn't even require any metal nails. Matoba sent this to a family member, Chioi Matoba, incarcerated at the Gila River camp in 1943. These objects connect us to individuals who experienced incarceration, and it begs the question, what happened to these people? Sadly, I couldn't find too much about what happened to these incarcerees and internees after the war. I found naturalization records consistent with the names of about 5 of them from period of 1951 through 53, but I can't be sure that those are the actual individuals and not people who simply share the name. For those who were interned, the experience often carried profound shame. Internment, unlike incarceration, often left family members with questions. Why was my brother, uncle, father, grandfather, or cousin separated from us? And with the trauma of incarceration, people often did not talk about their experiences, and so people were left to assume. It was often natural for families or communities to assume that individual internees had done something wrong, when in fact the vast majority had been picked up because they protested the violation of their civil liberties or were prominent community members. The reality is, it wasn't because they had done something wrong. The reality for most was far more complex and tragic. These objects are testament to that. Thank you for joining us on this pilgrimage. All the objects featured today can be found as part of our online collection hosted by Gleason Library at the University of San Francisco. Our archives are available by appointment at 1648 Post Street in San Francisco, 941115. To learn more about our archival records or museum objects, please email me at Lilith, Lilith, at njahs.org. To learn more about the Enemy Alien Files exhibit, please visit ninjas.org/enemy-alien-files or scan the QR code in this slide.